Thank you very much. Ready to go?
That's fine, Grant. We're streaming now.
Thanks, Debs. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this meeting of the Resources Committee. As usual, it's being held on Teams, and if by any reason I drop off the call for any reason, I'll ask Caroline Stewart to step in until I'm reconnected. I'd particularly like to welcome, in addition to the normal participants in this meeting, Fiona McQueen, who's chair of our People Committee, Michelle Miller, who's also on the People Committee, and to mention that we are well represented from the People Committee because although they're here primarily as members of the Resources Committee, Tom Halpin and Alistair Hay are also members of that committee. So we are particularly well placed to consider together the papers on VER scheme later on the agenda. So I'd also like to welcome those from other organisations who are joining in on this call. I know there are apologies from DCO Page and DCC Connors. Are there any other apologies as far as you're aware, Debs?
No other apologies, Chair.
Thank you. Are there any declarations of interest and connections? Oh, good. And could I seek your approval to take items 5 to 10 in private for the reasons recorded at the foot of the agenda? Thank you. So moving on to section 2, the minutes and actions from the previous meeting. The minute of their meeting on the 8th of August is there for approval. Seems a long time ago, actually. First of all, a lot has happened in that time. Is everybody happy that that's or members of the committee anyway, are they content that that's a true record of what we discussed?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. On 2.2, we have an action plan, which has only one item on it, which is the plans to have us monthly meetings with the committee members and Police Scotland Finance colleagues and the DCCs to discuss actions to bring the budget back into balance. These arrangements are now in place, so can we close that item? Thank you. And for item 2.3, we haven't taken any decisions since the last meeting, so we can just move straight on to section 3 and welcome. Sorry, the screen just moved people around at that point in time. Can I welcome James Gray and colleagues to speak to this particular item, the Q2 Financial Monitoring Report? James.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I know in the interest of time with a big agenda, but you're just looking by exception, so I'll just hand over to Lynn in the first instance, but we'll be happy to answer any questions that committee might have.
Okay, thank you very much. Welcome, Lynn.
Sorry, apologies. I'm having some technical problems there. Can everybody hear me okay? I don't know if my Teams is working properly.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
No, thank you. So yeah, we'll take the papers as read, but just keen to pull out a couple of key highlights from the paper, if that's okay, just for awareness. So we obviously presented the original Q1 forecast back in August, and that highlighted the forecast overspend at that time. Since then, we've put a number of mitigating actions into place, and we've been closely monitoring them along with our exec and SPA members over the course of the months in between. So the report, the dashboard Appendix A, just gives us an update in terms of where we are at Q2. So there's obviously been a lot of movement over the last few months, so the Q2 forecast takes account of any new pressures, any movements in the mitigating actions, etc. But what that has meant is that the revenue position has moved to high risk or critical in terms of delivery. We know there's still a lot of work to be done to land the overall position by year end. So the dashboard shows that as a Q2 forecast, we're currently forecasting 0.9 or just under £1 million overspending revenue, but that is offset by a corresponding reduction in reform. So overall, we are forecasting a break-even position, but like I say, this is dependent on delivering a number of savings and mitigating actions across the remainder of the year. There is some detail within the report around the risk deliverability of the items, etc. So that's all there for members to be seen, and the risk variability ranges from green to red being the ones that are out with our control. So that's probably the key things around revenue. The only other thing to add is obviously we will continue to monitor that closely. We'll provide updates, you know, as per the agreed timescales, etc. So yeah, so that's revenue. In terms of capital, we're just over 65% of our allocation spent at the end of Q2. We have had to take some action to manage the position over the remainder of the year. So essentially, for the remainder of the year, there'll be no new capital commitments. It'll just be the spend we've had to date plus the commitments that are made to date for delivery across the remainder of the financial year. So that's highlighted in the report as well. And then finally, just on reform, the reform forecast has been reduced as per the mitigating actions in terms of the reform contribution that is supporting the revenue position. So we can see that as a funded position in reform, that is showing the 0.9 million underspend, which is being used, as I said, to support the revenue position. So as I say, that's the kind of key highlights that I would like to pull out around Appendix A. There is also an Appendix B that is there for approval, and that's just really approving that we can adjust the budget by the additional funding that's been received in year for pay awards. So it doesn't affect the forecast position, it just lets us update that budget position to reflect that additional funding. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn. That's extremely clear, and the way these papers are laid out with graphics and so on, I think are extremely easy to follow. So thank you very much for covering these also clearly. I'll just pass straight on to members for questions. No questions. Fiona. Yeah, Fiona.
Sorry, I was wanting to give my Resources Committee colleagues their places.
That's all right.
Just like to echo Grant, you know, it's such a pleasure to see these papers. They're clear, they're concise, they're well briefed. So as a kind of newcomer into looking at the resources things, I think I mentioned that last time, but I don't underestimate the difficulty it takes to provide such professional papers. So I thank you and well done for that. So at People Committee, there's a lot of talk about pressure, operational commanders not being able to prioritise, the challenges there are in doing that. So how confident, and this is probably a Policing and Performance, People and Resources Committee, but you know, how confident are you, Lynn or James, that we will manage to make inroads? Now, I noticed on page 8 you've talked about overtime savings reduced. I don't know whether you mean actually overtime reducing or actually the savings that were predicted are not materialising. But to me, that's that real conundrum is, what more do we need to do to make sure that we're living within our means?
Thank you, Fiona. Very clear question. Lynn, I appreciate that part of the answer to that, the finance team is really the scorekeeper, if you like. This is where we would have benefited from having a senior member of Police Scotland executive present, because that would actually help to be able to give an operational aspect to Fiona's question. But anything you'd like to add, Lynn? Or I see we've also got James with his hand up as well.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Maybe I'll start. I see Patrick as well has got his hand up. I think what we've tried to do where we can and is to try and de-risk the workforce position from a financial perspective, obviously not operational. And when we're saying the reduction in the overtime saving, we're not talking about a reduction in the overtime budget. You're quite right, Fiona. It's about our initial assumption about how much of a reduction in the forecast overspend we would be able to achieve, and we have reduced our assumption, we've reduced our optimism around how much of a reduction in overspending of overtime that we would be able to achieve, and a number of reasons for that. One of which has been actually our experience over the summer, where initially we weren't seeing overtime coming down. We have seen progress through September and October, but we're now in the context of a lot of protests, for example. There's a lot of activity that results in short-term overtime demand that to an extent is non-controllable. Obviously, there's the operational decision making around deployment models, but when you've got large events that are out of the ordinary, then it is going to create that pressure, albeit it's been very tightly managed. There's a fortnightly overtime group that DCC Spears is chairing, and reflecting where we are in the year, the position that we've put forward, and I think we'll discuss later on into government around the funding ask for 24-25 reflects that our considerations around overtime, and as you have a reducing workforce, the need to have that bit of extra flexibility to manage with the reduced establishment that we've sought to increase overtime funding into the next financial year, just given it's not a particularly effective tool to push down on something where there is legitimacy and around it. I mean, there are certain areas where we know we need to try and improve upon, part of which is working with external agencies that are bringing demand into us by the way in which services are being delivered. But this kind of salami slicing approach and trying to push down wherever we can into the organisation is obviously suboptimal, and that is, as I say, one of the reasons why we have reduced our assumption around what we'll get out of overtime, in the same way that we have been prudent and cautious in what we think we might be able to achieve through the police staff workforce, which is the other element that is overspending. But looking ahead to next year and beyond, clearly this salami slicing approach is not sustainable, and I'm sure there'll be discussions in People Committee about that, but looking to try to move towards a kind of medium-term business planning approach around service redesign to actually make the workforce sustainable within the envelope, the financial envelope that we've got, and moving away from what has been, by necessity, quite a short to live within an annual budget with only a 3-month lead-in time to this financial year from when we got the settlement. So we are looking to try and hopefully through our negotiated discussions with government try and buy ourselves a little bit of breathing space to take a more informed strategic service redesign approach to allow us not to be back in the situation we find ourselves in the current year.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, James. Caroline, I think you were next.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, James. I suppose I'm just building on Fiona's question a wee bit, because one of the ways you manage through a downturn is managing your people count. And so I was just wondering where we are in terms of being able to kind of manage that piece, because one of the reasons that if you look at the numbers of where we are is because we've carried on hiring, especially into the police staff area, and that's a large part of why we're kind of a wee bit over budget now. So I'm just wondering what the approach is to that, because you're absolutely right. The balancing of the budget that we're trying to do at the moment is kind of out of non-pay, is sort of the things that we can't, salami slicing things that we can't really continue to do, and around the people piece is going to be really important going forward. So I just wondered if you could outline the strategy on that and how we're managing by headcount. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for the question, Caroline. I'll maybe just start and then I would hand to Patrick. At the moment, we've got a resource prioritisation group, which is the in-year mechanism for handling this. And as I say, we would want to get to something that's kind of more strategic in approach. But Patrick has been the main kind of finance point on this. And I know Katie Miller obviously is involved, who I think is on the call for later items. But I see Patrick has got his hand up, so maybe we'd hand to him in the first instance, and then maybe Katie might want to say something.
Thank you. Thanks, James. And I see Katie's actually on the call already. But Patrick,
Thank you, Chair and Caroline. Thank you kind of for the question. So we are still continuing with all the mitigations that we've put in through the resource prioritisation strategic group, including the continued exemption process to ensure that we are still able to recruit to critical positions, but obviously kind of hold others back until we continue to kind of control the kind of staffing kind of budget. And obviously there's papers kind of later today where we'll go into that in more depth. But there is also the additional level of scrutiny as all corporate directors under DCO's chair review the headcount statistics every week. So this is not something we're just looking at a monthly basis. Heather Cunningham, the head of recruitment, provides this kind of detail every week, looking at attrition, looking at what positions we're still holding, the impact that that's having. So there is quite a bit of scrutiny does continue to be on that basis. So it is quite kind of well handled and under control through these kind of groups. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Patrick. I think that's quite reassuring, because it's getting a grip on this, and also being able to remove posts from the org chart as we go are going to be really important, that we don't end up sort of filling them again. Managing through a downturn is difficult, and you manage it through really aggressive headcount sort of management. So thanks.
Thank you. Alistair.
Yeah, thanks, Chair, and thanks for the very clear reports. I'm looking at the mitigation action tracker, which is really useful, and I see we've got a few red ambers in there, so that reflects a change in risk. But like Fiona, and what was built on by Caroline as well, I just want to pick on something that came up at the Performance Committee, which I chair. And at the Performance Committee, one of the ACCs, when we were discussing the Resource Deployment Unit, explained that he's concerned about the levels of response resource and the impact of lack of availability to provide proactive policing due to reduction in headcount and availability for deployment. And to mitigate this, Police Scotland have been moving community officers into response and addressing how modified duties officers can be utilised. But what he advised is that officers are being pushed harder to respond to complex calls, and he's concerned for the welfare and the well-being of these colleagues. And he expressed concern about managing these risks. Now, we've fallen through on this, but in terms of the budget and the mitigating actions, what I would like to understand a little bit better is, when you're taking these actions, it's a conscious decision-making process, and you're doing an organisational impact assessment, so that, whilst it's not an optimal place that you're in, and the actions, the budget balancing actions, as you've explained, are absolutely necessary, you're not creating bigger problems through unintended consequences. It's really about that conscious decision making, and perhaps doing impact assessments as you're doing it. Could you explain what you're doing in that area, please?
Patrick, you got. I'm not sure who's best placed to answer this, because it's largely operational.
Well, we can kind of make a start on it, and maybe look to kind of Katie from kind of a people perspective, maybe to kind of add to this. So Alistair, throughout the kind of whole process and kind of identifying the kind of savings options, there's been very kind of in-depth conversations with all operational colleagues through SLB, through the RPSG, which has, really looked at the kind of impact, inequality impacts arising from the decision we've taken. So they all have been conscious decisions and have been kind of considered and documented through that basis. Maybe potentially we need to look at kind of strengthening just the kind of documentation around that area. But I think when we have taken these decisions, we have changed our approach in some areas. And I'll just kind of use an example. I just shadowed the whole operation Moonbeam. I shadowed the kind of Gold Commander ACC mayors on that, and the whole RDU around that. And we planned for the biggest public order deployment for Operation Moonbeam that Scotland has had since COP26, based on all the intelligence kind of gathering. And we changed our approach of how we planned that to kind of take less reliance on overtime, give advance notice to the officers of deployment to manage that kind of well-being. Some were eventually kind of stood down, but we had given them the kind of advance notice and changed their approach, kind of learning lessons kind of from the past, both to manage the well-being of the officers with advance notice, but also to manage the budget situation to avoid overtime and work within kind of regulations as possible. So I do think all of that is being kind of taken into consideration, but I'd maybe look to Katie to add a bit more to that from the kind of RSDG and RPSG perspective, as well as James.
Thanks, Patrick. Katie, would you like to add anything to that?
Thank you, Chair. I think that we do recognise that there's a number of complexities in relation to both officer and staff and some of the decisions that are being made. As Patrick said, we have got very clear governance in place, which includes representation from all the ACCs at a kind of a first level, and then second level to DCCs and DCO. So we are absolutely talking about the risks in relation to this. I think specifically in relation to officers, some of the pieces that we're really trying to focus on are around modified officers. So we've seen a year-on-year increase, but we know that there's absolutely valuable roles and valuable contributions that those individuals can continue to make to our organisation. So we've set up new panels in relation to national panels to really look at how we can kind of maximise those opportunities. So I think, we're not shying away from the fact that there are some really hard decisions that we're making that are having an impact on the workforce, but we are seeking to mitigate as much as we're able to at this time.
Right. Thanks, Katie. I think on this point, this is where we would have benefited from a DCC or ACC perspective on how this is actually working in practice, not just as laid down, because the finance team, with great respect to the tremendous ability to record things, can only record its plan and record, but it's how it works on the ground that's very important, and being sure that someone or a team of people at DCC or ACC level are holding the reins on making sure it's working as planned, or making ongoing adjustments to fine-tune it as required. Tom, sorry, you've been very patiently waiting.
Thanks, Chair. And just to reinforce your remarks that you've just made there, having an operational perspective of the impact of resources is extremely important for this committee. Thanks for the reports. They're easy to follow, etc. And my remarks are building on the point that Alice was making around the sort of the red rag status in the report. There's one area in particular I'd like to hear some sort of comment or a view on the likelihood of it realising is the significant amount of money in terms of the balance of the budget aligned to property disposal. And if that's not going to happen, we need to know that as soon as the likelihood, just a view on that. And the other one that's not there that I was wondering, should it actually appear under the threats model, is that a lot of activities have been deferred into 24, 25, and there's always a risk in that short-term relief in the medium term it becomes more strain, and I'm thinking the likes of officer safety training being delayed, training through the police college being delayed, that those resources will have to eventually come back and receive that training. So is that a threat? I know the threats here are in this financial year, but is that something that we should be recording somewhere, that the impact of that deferred activity in the budget for next year as well? So 2 areas, property and deferred activity.
Thanks, Tom. And I was just about to ask James to respond to both of these, so you came right on screen at the right time. Excuse me.
Thank you, Chair. On the first point around property, it is a high risk item, and I think it's disclosed now as the highest risk item that we've got. It is still, possible that we will see that this year, but it's an ever decreasing window. So that's why we've put it to that level of risk, and that is something that we are considering in the background, and I know we'll come on to speak about period 7 after the end of this committee, and can get into a bit more detail around the kind of timelines and so on around that and the risk. But it is possible that it could still sell this year. But as I say, with every passing month, that reduces. And as you quite rightly say, around the wider issue around some of these, the sustainability of these things, well, clearly the disposal of a building is a one-off anyway, so it wouldn't be helping us into our starting position for next year. And as you know, recognizing as well things like pausing training and recruitment pauses, and so none of these tools are sustainable, and they have been necessitated by the fact that there wasn't a long lead-in time to this financial year, and we were seeing those overspends in early part of the year, and we've had to take fairly blunt measures to try and curb spending, but recognizing that is not a sustainable approach into the future. I think looking ahead to 24-25, the cumulative impact of things like slowing down training and putting pauses on things and one-off items total somewhere in the region of £10 million. So actually, before we do anything next year, we need to come up with something else that's sustainable to cover that 10 million, because we can't continue to follow this approach into the next financial year. The only caveat on that would be that should we not receive the level of funding that we have spoken to government about, then we may be forced into this continuation of a kind of salami slicing approach, and not having the space to do something more strategiig. But if we do get that bit of breathing space, then we would look to make what we've done this year with regards to landing the budget sustainable into next year, recognizing that we need to find £10 million of sustainable solutions in order to kind of clear the decks, if you like, of the financial year that we're currently in. So it does give us an added challenge going into next year, because it's the cumulative effect of wherever we get to next year with funding against what our spending requirements are. We're already bringing forward, if you like, carrying forward a 10 million shortfall that we will need to address, and that has been factored in to the financial planning work that's been done, and also this imperative to take a more strategic business planning approach to how we deal with this into future years. And I think we'll discuss that more fully when we get to the financial planning paper.
Thank you very much, James. Tom, are you happy with these answers?
Yeah, I think the answers that we've got in the stressful times that we're in financial planning, I just keep in record my concern that salami slicing is still the approach that's the reality, and as you say, James, is not sustainable. And even with more money, it still doesn't take away the pressure for that redesign. And just from a committee, I think I'd want to reinforce that.
Thanks, Tom. Certainly the points you've just raised in relation to the mitigating actions tracker were ones that I was going to highlight. But I think the responses make it clear that actually these are not one-off savings. These are just deferring things into the following year. So we're achieving. We thought we'd started off this year with a balanced budget. So it's very disappointing that we're in the situation where we're having to defer a lot of items. But that's actually just pushing the problem into next year and beyond. So that is, I think, the comments that James has made about the fact that we're starting off with a need to get a better grip over the recurring items and being sure that we're actually on track for next year onwards is absolutely essential for the long-term viability of the organisation. Sorry, Fiona, you wanted to come in? Fiona.
Yeah, thanks, Grant. Just in addition to that, and fully accept the explanations, but at People Committee yesterday we were hearing, so it's not just, and I'm not for a minute saying anyone is saying that, I think I'm just adding to our worries. It's not just a question of X amount of people have to go for training. Where the training that's not being offered is, say, driver training, then that puts additional pressure onto those members of staff who do have the skills and competence and have the training to do that work. So actually it further restricts operational responses and puts pressure on those who have the training. So I appreciate that everyone here knows and understands that, but I think I'm just echoing everyone's thoughts that we do need to take a more longer term view on this, so that we actually can have the transformation, but also make sure there's a workload with the prioritisation of work, so that we're not asking staff to do the impossible, and that actually do have meaningful stretching work that is within a reasonable range of pressure.
Thank you, Fiona. That's a very important point to get emphasised. We've been talking quite a lot about revenue, and Lynn actually highlighted that on capital, we have effectively got to put the brakes on further capital and commitments. Certainly, page 10 of the appendix actually makes it very plain that no further commitments can be made in the current financial year without an additional layer of approval. But I think that schedule on page 10 actually spells out very clearly where we are to date, the committed, and where we are. And again, it's an extremely good presentation of it. But I thought it was worth emphasising that this is unusual. We're not normally at this stage in the year where we're in the position where we cannot incur more capital commitments. So it just demonstrates that quite a lot has changed. And part of this is because there was obviously a back-end loading to the capital in the past, and that's been overcome by early commitments, which is extremely helpful on the one hand, but does actually present us with a bit of a challenge where we've got, well, what, 4.5 months to go, and we can't really take on anything else. Patrick, is there anything you want to add to that?
Just really to add, as you say, Chair, there is a positive and negative on that. We have achieved what we kind of set out to do, which was kind of start to move away from the backloading and start to spread a bit more equally. It's maybe swung the pendulum a bit too much in terms of too much too early, kind of up front. But the important kind of message here is the plan and intention did kind of deliver to spend kind of quicker. What we are doing here is we're not saying do not, stop all development of the case, because we want to keep this trajectory going, that capital is ready to spend and deliver early in the year. So we're saying do not make any of the kind of formal commitments now, but keep developing kind of the business cases and the plans for next year, so we can make as good and as positive a start going into kind of next year to ensure that we kind of keep the pace of delivery up. So I just wanted to bring that very kind of clear nuance to say we are saying do not make the commitment now, but that does not mean down tools on the design and the development right now, because we want to keep this trajectory up kind of going forward. So that's all I wanted to add, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. Yes, I mean, I think the benefit of that is that come 1st of April next year, we'll be able to enter things and get straight on with them rather than start again. So that's very important. And of course, one of the balancing factors on getting towards some reduction in the projected overspend is by taking 0.9 million out of reform. So that means that, again, that's deferring what will have to be spent in reform into next year. So once you sort of borrow, if you like, in that form, there's a payback at a later stage. Right. Any other questions from anybody on the call, on the committee? Caroline.
Thanks, and it was really on that point, Grant, and I just thought, I know we're a bit overcommitted for this year, but I did just want to say, after years and years and years of being at the back end for capital expenditure, it's quite nice to see us front loading, and even if that's gone over a wee bit, I think that's a complete swing round in terms of our approach. So I think that's working quite well in terms of, getting things in the pipe early rather than being in month 10 thinking, how do we get rid of this? So I think that deserves a call out to say well done for that.
Yeah. Thanks, Caroline. Point well made. I mean, it's interesting to see that in the past, being able to rely on being able to purchase more fleet vehicles was obviously the sort of easy ability to meet the spend commitment in the latter months of the year. But I see actually in the programme on page 9, we've actually spent 12.1 million. Really, the entire fleet purchase has already been incurred this year. So it's really, to some extent, bringing the other categories into place so that we're able to spend the money we plan to spend on things like digital fleet, digital estates, EV infrastructure, and the various other categories. We need to be able to bring them on board early next year. So thank you all for your questions on that item. What we're asked to do is to note and discuss the Q2 financial position, which we've done. But we're also asked, as Lynn touched on, to approve a budget revision of 18.3 million increase in the revenue budget in Appendix 2. Are we happy to do that? We haven't really gone into that in detail. Does anybody want to clarify anything in Appendix 2, which really sets out how the budget has been amended? I think the paper is very clear. Okay, so we're happy to approve that. Okay, thank you very much. Right. This takes us on to transformation benefits, section 4. And we welcome Andrew Hendry. Now, Andrew, your paper's very clear, and you can take it that we've studied it. So, is there anything you'd like to say quite briefly before we go into questions?
Thanks, Chair. I was going to pass to Kerry just to give the summary, but I'll be directed by you.
Pardon? Sorry, could you repeat that, please?
So I was going to say, Kerry's joined the call to speak to the summary, so I'll just pass to her if that's okay.
Right. Yes. Thank you. Kerry.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, I take the paper as read, and there's probably only a couple of things I wanted to call out, and then obviously open to questions. So, as the paper said, just wanted to call out a few things to note that we have gone to a 3-year view for the overviews, which was a direction from Change Board in the recent months. We used to report over a 6-year period in these reports. Obviously, we will continue to monitor that over a 10-year period. So at any point, either internally or externally, if people wish to see that, we can absolutely provide it. But just to provide a bit more focus on what we're looking at last year, this year and the following year, that has been amended. And the other thing that you'll note of difference is that we've actually gone to reporting in hours when it comes to staff and officers. Now, again, we have both internally. So, again, happy to take, we'll take the steer. So, but for the report, you'll see that's moved into hours. The other thing just to call out really changes. There's been a slight increase in the cashable actuals, which was a slight delay in getting a validation for the previous year, but that's now been added in. And the only other thing I was going to call out here, just really to draw attention to members, is for the cashable benefits, you'll see there's 3.6 million that are due this financial year. We're obviously into November, so I'd expect people to be asking when are we going to see some of these realised. But these are two real, the biggest chunk of these are NatNet and NEDIP, so they make up 3.1 million of that. We won't validate them till post the financial year, which is standard practice. It was the same for last year. So once we get to the end of the year, we'll validate those with finance just to make sure, because they're mostly around contracts and things that we're obviously not carrying on with. They were in the budgets last year and they were validated. It's usually about June time, so it is quite normal to see a lag in the financial actuals until we've gone through that process. There are other, obviously, is about 0.5, which is made up of numerous things around e-recruitment, etc., which is detailed in the other packs. But and that's really about the cashable. And for the officers and staff, again, that's a similar view. Probably you'll see most of those are made up from the delivery of the CAUSE programme, and they have recently had a change request that reforecasted their benefits into this year and early next year. And we're expecting the first chunk of that to be validated in December. So you should see in the next report them start to come through. So I just wanted to give a wee bit of context of why they're maybe all sitting at zero primarily for this year. But as I say, that that they are on track to deliver when we've planned them in. So they're not tracking behind. But I thought it was maybe worth calling that out, Chair. That's me. Thank you.
Thanks, Kerry. Could you just clarify before I open it up for questions? The validation. Is that purely by our finance team, or who's actually validating it?
So it's done jointly. So the person, the benefits owner, will confirm that they're content that actually they haven't spent the money that they said they were not going to spend, and then finance validate that it's not actually gone through the books.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for clarifying that. I'll open it up for questions. Caroline.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Kerry, for this report. So I find this report not very easy to read, to be honest, and I don't find it hugely helpful in terms of how you manage a massive portfolio of projects which had very clear business cases, which secured down the funding. And I also would quite like you to talk me through why we've reprofiled the sort of forecast benefits over 10 years for some of them. I just want you to talk through that reprofiling, because I'm not terribly sure I've got that in my head particularly well. And my final thing is around the people efficiencies part. And we've talked about this before. Andrew will be very well aware of the conversations around this. But if I even just take on your page, one of the document where the update since June, you've got staff efficiencies of 195,000 hours. Now, if I multiply that by a rough working week, that equates roughly to me in the back of my fact packet to about 100 staff. But then on the other hand, we've been recruiting, and we've recruited another 200 staff in that period. So I'm kind of struggling here to understand where the efficiencies are, how these people are moved into a redeployment pool, how we're actually starting to manage this, because all I see is that we say these numbers, but then we recruit another 200 where we've saved 100. So I'm kind of struggling to get all this in my head. And back to where my first points, and I don't know if you were on the call at that point, which is the way we manage through downturns is by headcount. And therefore, if we're doing these projects and we're saying as part of the business case that headcounts will be saved, we are actually having to start to manage these headcounts out of the business. So I'd appreciate if you could talk me through that approach and how we're starting to put some more rigorous controls around this. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'll probably hand to Andrew for the second part, but I suppose just to your first question around the reprofiling, we've always looked at benefits. We track them over we have a 10-year view. So maybe the language was loose, but we have a 10-year view. Obviously, not all projects have benefits over 10 years, so we're not reprofiling. We're saying we've got a 10-year view internally, which we've always had. For these reports, we used to show the 6-year, and we've gone to a 3-year. So we've not actually changed it, if that helps, Caroline. So apologies if that wasn't explained properly. But yeah, and I'll hand over to Andrew around the efficiency piece, if that's okay.
Yes, thanks, Kerry. Yes, over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Kerry. Thanks, Caroline. So, Caroline, as you say, we've discussed this a number of times. I certainly think, given the challenges we've got currently in the mechanics that are being developed, that link between the FTE efficiency, which we can stand by and demonstrate, and the organisational change and shift is now in focus. And I think the governance forums that have been established for overall organisational design, and as you say, managing the organisation by FTE, is going to be the mechanics now for actually allowing us to kind of pull the levers that you describe. I think historically, as we've said, benefits have landed where they fell. And I think we have had some organisational challenges in regards to how we manage that. I very much see that changing as we enter the new financial year. And that's partly, as I said, off the back of the governance that's been set up around managing our headcount, but also as we look to reinvest efficiencies and or use them to meet financial challenges. That's something where we are. I think the kind of historic journey to here, we're going to have to draw a line at some point and I think still demonstrate the organisational impact of those efficiencies. But I would like to probably start the new financial year in that new lever-based mechanical space where we can actually do that almost one-to-one type mapping for areas of efficiencies. And I think, when you look at the portfolio going forward, much more of our efficiency activity will be based probably on a much more one-to-one FTE mapping. Previously, I think the kind of 10 minutes here and there through process improvements is where we've got to with things like cause, etc. But we're still going to commit to being able to demonstrate, the positive impact and where that's kind of landed as part of our kind of close down of those programmes. So I suppose just giving you confidence that we do continue to recognise that there's a bit of work to be done here, but I do see part of the planning for the next few years, linked to the financial plan, that the mechanics will be there for us. So thank you.
So yeah, Andrew, and I think that approach will be welcome. And I do think then you'll need to change your report quite substantially to reflect that. So that would be nice to maybe start seeing how you perhaps attend. And I don't know whether Katie is still on the call, but I think in terms of this managing the redeployment pool, we're going to have to see a much more clear line of sight between these projects being delivered and then people being moved into a redeployment pool, and then what's the policy around that redeployment pool in terms of how we manage this. So I think there's a bit of joining up here across the business to be taken. If we're going to keep on signing off big multi-million-pound projects which deliver efficiencies, then we're going to have to start, and we've been saying this as a committee for a long time now, that we're going to start cashing the checks, and now is the time we're cashing the checks. So it'd be quite nice to see how we're going to see a clear line of sight between that and what actually happens on the other side. Thanks.
Thanks, Caroline. Anything else you want to add to that, Andrew, before I move on to Katie?
No, sorry, legacy hand, Chair, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Katie, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. If I can just respond to Caroline's comments. Actually, we had a session yesterday on the revised strategic workforce plan with the People Committee. And actually this for me is the underpinning bit then that starts to pull together the foundational work that we need to do as an organisation, but also the mid to longer term pieces. So hopefully that gives you some comfort.
It does. Thanks, Katie.
Yeah. Thanks, Katie. I think what you've just touched on the strategic workforce plan is key to the way forward with this, as indeed with many other organisations, to make sure that it's all pulled together, and then the financial impact of that can be considered in that context.
But it's also around making sure that once positions have been freed up through efficiency gains, that they are actually removed from the org chart and they don't just slide in again. So backdoor recruitment drive. That's the key. That is the key for managing through downturns. You know, it's eliminating them off the org chart. That's the key. So thanks.
Okay, thank you, Alistair.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair, and thanks, Kerry, for the paper. And you actually preempted one of my questions earlier, so thank you for that. But what I would like to ask, though, is if you look at, I think it's slide 3, transformation benefits, September 2023 progress updates, you know, and it makes, in bullet point, it tells you the benefits that have been delivered. And if I look at the wellbeing one, it talks about improved officer and staff satisfaction, levels due to improved technology support, improved care of victims and vulnerable persons. So maybe using that as an example, how do you evidence that these are actually the benefits that have been delivered?
So I'll come in, Andrew may want to come in as SRO on CODS, but so how we measure that is working very closely with the divisions, to be honest. So we agree what those benefits look like going forward. And then there's a quite an industry behind CODS, as you'd imagine, because of the size and scale of it, Alistair. So we're currently, which is why we'll probably have them in December, we're currently working through that with the divisions and making sure that they recognise some of the work that has, you know, that's enabled the well-being around, you know, people just being able to do things once and not having to do things in multiple places, you know, being able to do things on their mobile phone and all that kind of stuff. So they're all benefits that we have recognised and sort of documented, if you like, really early up front. And obviously they've evolved as we've gone through the last couple of years, but currently we're working through that validation with obviously the programme and the divisional commanders. And I think, if I'm right, that first tranche has actually made its way back and everybody's content with what we said we've delivered and the level of it. Andrew, I don't know from an SRO if there's anything else you want to add, but that's how we do it, Alistair, if that helps.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to support Kerry's point there, I think through assurance, follow-up and kind of real feedback, we get to quantify that. And I think also in the design of the solutions, a lot of the designs are actually marked around seeking those benefits in the first place. So in a way, we kind of set it out at the start and then validate it at the end. And I think the benefit of the size and scale we get, you know, we get a varied perspective from across different locations and, you know, styles of policing that then supports our narrative.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Thanks, Alistair. Any other questions from anybody? No. Right. And I think, Andrew, Kerry, thank you very much for these papers. And we do note that the changes you've made in reporting periods and the way you've moved on to hours rather than FTEs and so on. I think the bottom line from the committee's point of view is that over the years we get various business cases for a case for investing to achieve savings and efficiencies. What is so important is that we see how these are actually delivered. Some will deliver more benefits and savings than expected, some maybe less, but we need to be able to have a close eye on that. But if we're taking people's time out one way or another, I think it's very important that we understand either these people have left the organisation or they've moved on to specific other roles, so that there's absolute clarity as to what is being achieved as compared to the individual business plan. And I think I don't underestimate the challenge of doing so. I think perhaps doing it in hours now makes it a little easier than converting them to FTEs. But right across the organisation, there have been a lot of plans over a number of years. And I think what we're really all keen to see, so that it can be demonstrated, frankly, in our annual report, that all the initiatives that have been put in place to achieve transformational benefits are being delivered, and how the benefits are then being transformed into delivering other things in the organisation, or it's achieving reduction in perhaps headcount or whatever. We've seen the force reduction from 17,234 to about 16,500. Clearly, that part of that's come from the benefits of transformation. But I think we've got to have total clarity into for our stakeholders being able to see exactly what we have delivered. So the continual monitoring and verification, validation of them all is so important. Thank you very much indeed. I think that lets us move on to the private session.